Welcome to our fourth session of the books of Moses, the Torah. We have gone through and looked at the story of Genesis. There are two major types of material that we have in the books of Moses. What are they? Two major types of material. Narrative, or stories, and law, or instruction. Okay? So we have a story about the family of Abraham. Of course, the early stuff in Genesis 1. So we have the story about Abraham and how his family went down into Egypt. Now we're going to have the story about how they get back out. It is harder in some ways to teach this unit than any other. Not just today, but I mean the first 10, because it's a lot of legal material. And it's not as exciting. We like to have something that's a lot more exciting that we can go with and telling stories. If you think back to your days in Sunday school, if you went to Sunday school, I doubt that you ever got a lesson on Leviticus. Maybe you got one, but probably they were skipping through to something more important. And maybe you got the talking donkey in Numbers, but that may be about all of it for Balaam and his donkey, and probably very little, if anything, from Deuteronomy. And I notice this when I look with my granddaughters at their little Bibles that they have, their story Bibles, and they skip through a lot of that stuff very quickly. But what we have here is not a kind of a narrative of every 5 years we have the important things. I don't know if you've ever seen that. There's a book of timelines, and starts out real early with the geological ages and everything, but it'll say, okay, in 1734 BC, Nebuchadnezzar I issued, or Hammurabi issued the Hammurabi Law Code, or whatever the year would be. And so, in essence, it's hard to date anything from Genesis 1 to 11. Genesis 12, most people would say Abraham is about 2,000 years before Christ. So about as far before Christ as we are after. Now, it could be 2100, it could be 1900. We don't have much in reference to actual individual countries where we would know how to date a particular pharaoh or something like that, or somebody in Iraq. And so it's kind of hard to put those pieces together. But roughly, the people who were wandering out, kind of like when our people went out to settle the West, you can kind of have a framework that this was part of that. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph and his brothers going down to Egypt, you can think that that's maybe a couple hundred years, maybe a little bit more than that. So from the time that Abraham gets called in chapter 12, overarching over the whole thing is the promise, I will be with you and I will give you a land. Now the tension in Genesis 50 is Joseph and his brothers are down in Egypt. They've left the land. Remember when Abraham went down to Egypt and lied about his wife being his sister, he got kicked out pretty quickly. Goes back to the land. Isaac, when he is at the time of a lack of rain and all of that, and the drought, he is told just stay in the southwestern part of the country, and he goes down to Gerar to Abimelech, as Abraham had done. Jacob has to flee up into Syria and gets Leah and Rachel and the two concubines, the two servant girls, and then he says, no, God wants me to come back to the land. And I apologize, I have just never put it together this way to intersperse maps. Kathy and I have had this discussion. Those of you who were with me for many of these over at Emmaus remember that for a good bit of time I had a map hanging up there to kind of give some frame of reference, at least for the land of Israel. But I just plain have never taken the time or learned how to cut in a map here at the appropriate places. So I'll just ask you to be kind enough to look in the back of your Bible. Most of you have some maps in the back of your Bible to kind of look at some of the things. But basically, the land of Egypt is one of the first two major civilizations. You have southern Iraq, which would have been known as Acadia, later Assyria, and Sumer, which is right down by the head of the Persian Gulf. That goes all the way, each of them go back to at least about 3,000 years before Christ. Egypt has the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, with the first and the second intermediate period. And so Egypt is already kind of on its way downhill about 1,000 years before Christ. In Iraq, which is going to be east and northeast of Israel, they're going to have many, many more times when there will be powers that will come out of them. But we're going to be looking at Egypt now. So at this time, I think there are 30 dynasties that are identified. There was a man named Manetho, M-A-N-E-T-H-O, who was some sort of an Egyptian priest who wrote a book about all of the pharaohs and the various dynasties, some of them very old, some of them less, or closer to the reality of the time he had. But you have Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt because the Nile flows toward the Mediterranean. Upper Egypt is the south, Lower Egypt is the north. Okay, and at the north, I think that my best recollection is there are 5 major streams that separate out north of Cairo to form the Nile Delta. Okay, so you're going to have a lot of silt and everything that will build up over the years. Used to be great, great farmland. It's getting real bad now because the salt is not getting washed out. When they put the Aswan Dam in, and started controlling the water flow so people wouldn't be flooded, then that means you don't have any real gushers of water going through and replenishing the land. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile. So when Kathy and I have been there I guess we've been there twice, Kathy, or 3 times? Just twice, I think. We actually flew all the way down to Aswan, and we saw the Aswan Dam. We were there. My cousin Robert was kind enough to give Kathy and me a trip with the president of Concordia, Austin, who was going to see the Coptic monasteries. Coptic is the Greek word. Actually, Egypt also is a form of that Greek word. So it's what the Greeks called Egypt. So E-G-P-T and Coptic, there are some of the same consonants that are in that. And so we have been to the southern, well, by the Aswan Dam, and we've been to the north. We haven't been in the middle as much, but what we did, we went out in the western desert. The far western of the 5 arms is Alexandria, which was actually developed much, much later, of course, but the Jewish people themselves had like 1 million people in Alexandria at the time of Jesus. So when they say that Jesus and that Jesus' mom and dad went down into Egypt to flee from Herod, that was a long established thing. Now, the pyramids, when would you date the pyramids? You wouldn't, you would date people, but if you were to give a date when the pyramids were being built. Starting kind of in the 5th dynasty, about 2500 before Christ. A little bit before that is Saqqara, which is the stepped pyramid, which is just, so the Nile kind of is in a valley, okay? The water gets, washes the dirt and everything out. Up on a hill to the west was Saqqara, S-A-Q-Q-A-R-A, which was kind of a step pyramid like this. Later, they built them and then they faced them. All the facing got taken away. So now it still looks like little steps and maybe blocks that are, they might be as big as a table, not that thick. Nobody really knows. They've tried really hard to figure out how they built those things. And we got all the way to Cairo. We got all the way to the pyramids. And we get to the 3 big pyramids that are the usual ones that you see. She wouldn't go in.
Well,
I said, this thing has been here for 4,500 years. Let's go up in here. She wouldn't go in. So I had to climb up inside the pyramid all by my lonesome with Muhammad, who walked up the steps with me. And later they said, well, you know, we're having a little bit of trouble because all of the breathing and everything is kind of making things fall apart a little bit. And she said, see? So, we've had some nice experiences, even travel for a few kilometers on camels together and some other neat stuff along the way. But Egypt produces lots of grain if you can irrigate it. So maybe you get 15 miles each side of the Nile. And if you can plant the grain and then harvest it, the boats that they use along the Nile are rather shallow. That they would bring up. And so what the Israelites are going to be doing is they are going to be building grain elevators, okay, storage cities up in the Nile Delta where they can have ships that have a deeper draft to them and can go all around the rest of the Mediterranean. So to Phoenicia, which is Lebanon, and I'm sure Syria would get some of that as well, and Turkey, what's today Turkey, and Greece, and Italy. And so they're selling grain. Okay, people were doing business long time ago, so different people have different kind of products that they will use. And the water, what do you call it? What do you call it when the water is underground flowing?
irrigation.
No,
Aquifer?
no, Dale.
The Grand River.
Well, what do you call that?
Spring?
Washing out.
No, where the water is moving underneath the,
Aqueducts?
no,
The current?
current. I knew there was a word there. The currents go from the south, from Africa, go up along by Israel, and then go toward the west. And so the current would be very easy from Egypt to go up all along that area and be able to supply their grain to various places. They have a ship from about 1200 before Christ that actually has goods that sank, and they've been able to excavate it, that has goods from 7 different countries. So we ought not think that nobody lived there and it was all kind of empty. Civilization was going on a long time before that. But the pyramids were there. By the time Abraham got there, they would have been there 600, 700, 800 years. All right, by then already. All right, and so the leaders, they say there's a red and a white part of the hat for the pharaohs, because southern Egypt and northern Egypt, whoever could coordinate things like the irrigation system, and anybody who was coming to attack them, though that didn't seem to be as much of a problem for some reason, they were the ones who would become the pharaoh. All right, so if you could keep people in line and keep them working together, then you had a pretty rich and well-to-do country. It's kind of hard to attack Egypt because it's not like there's a lot of gold or anything there, though they did have copper mines down in the Sinai Peninsula, which would have been to the east of Cairo, across what is now the Suez Canal. So when Israel is going down into Egypt, are they going down there to be punished?
No, they're escaping a drought.
They're escaping a drought. So what was their sin? Well, they did sell Joseph.
Yeah.
Okay? They did sell Joseph. The consequence was they got saved. Okay? Instead of that, they got punished. So when they're going to be delivered from Egypt, it is not delivery from their sins. Like we would say, we're delivered from our sins when we're given salvation. All right? They're always hovering over this is the promise, I'm going to give you and your descendants the land of Canaan. All right? And so the strange thing is between Genesis 50 and Exodus 1, is probably somewhere around 350, 400 years with not a word. Not a word about anything. We find out that Joseph died, and then Exodus 1 says, well, new Pharaoh rose who did not know Joseph. Now, if you've got 30 dynasties along the way, most people suggest that what had happened in the time after Joseph got down there was that there were some people who did come and did conquer Egypt. And they're known as the Hyksos, Hyksos. And the Hyksos, apparently earlier than the Egyptians, figured out how to make chariots with horses and chariots, okay, that would be used as war weapons. When our son Daniel graduated from the George Washington University, there was one of his professors, and he graduated with that master's in international security studies. And so I said, well, I'll pick this one prof's brain a little bit, because he was talking about war and implements of war and things like that. And I said, when I'm teaching, I often say that history is the history of weapons. Another way you could talk about it is history of water. So there are various things. But he said, well, not really. He says, not really history of weapons. It's a history of people learning how to use them to their advantage. So you may have a weapon developed and nobody knows what to do with it. And then somebody else figures out what to do with it. And so then you can say, well, we're going to be able to conquer them. Well, the Egyptians came and they had chariots. So now you don't just need to be going into battle with somebody where you're going to go in and everybody's got war weapons. So what they used to do is they had wagons that would pull the weapons around. Everybody would take them off the wagon and then go fight with a spear or something like that. Now you had the speed factor as well. The native Egyptians during the 1600s apparently fled south, and since the Hyksos had forgotten to file a patent, they just not had gotten to get to the patent office, the native Egyptians looked at those things and said, we're going to design one ourselves. And so they designed and learned how to train the horses that could be used. And so the time with where we're coming now is probably the beginning of the New Kingdom era, where the Hyksos got booted out. Now, if that's true, then it wouldn't be so hard if everybody who was in a leadership position came from somewhere else to see that Joseph could rise in power. Because everybody would have, it's not like 14 generations of Egyptians are running the show. Later in the New Kingdom area, with a fellow named Achmoza and Thutmoza, where Moses' name comes in there as well, they come back, and Ramses, the MSS in Ramses, is from that same word Moses. Ra is the god of the sun. And so the one who is involved in blessings and things like that. And I know very, very, very little about Egyptian. When I was an orderly at St. Louis, the charge nurse, her husband, told me Egyptian is easy to learn. And he was a lay person, but he did quite a bit of writing about the history of Egypt and things. And I saw him even in a couple of meetings later. And he says, oh, it's very easy to learn how to read Egyptian, but I guess I haven't gotten there yet. But it is a system of pictures that are used as letter sounds. Okay, versus Akkadian, which is some wedge-shaped characters in the clay that they would have used. And there are different pictures, and you would use, they would have a consonant and a vowel, so bit or pit or be or pe, like Hammurabi or Hammurapi or something like that. They had maybe 8 characters. That's a really hard language. I tried that one. So Egyptian isn't quite as bad apparently, but you got to know whether you're going this way or that way and up and down. But this was all developed long before Moses. I mean, they were using writing, and in Egypt you would use not clay but papyrus, which is kind of a 3-sided stalk. And so with papyrus, then they would dry that, they would kind of split it, and then lay it open and crisscross it. And so papyrus is the standard thing they would use. And the nice thing about it was, if you're in a very dry climate, it survives. Okay. Now, baked clay will survive as well if they would make a tablet and then bake it, but it's a lot clumsier to be able to haul it around. And so each of them had their own kind of writing system. So part of the idea of the background here is just to realize there's a lot of history that had gone on. Hundreds and hundreds, and by the time of Moses, maybe 13 or 1400 years of history in Egypt. Okay, we're not just breaking fresh ground as Adam and Eve get out of Egypt, or get out of the Garden of Eden. And so these are developed societies, and so the Israelites are going to be enslaved as the time goes on. Somebody says it's nice to have them do the work, then we don't have to. So anyway, Exodus 1 and 2 is going to cover roughly about 40 years. We have the people of Israel crying out in their bondage, right? Cry out in their bondage. Then God hears them. Then Moses is born, and then he gets in trouble because he killed a native Egyptian for beating up one of his fellow Hebrews, and then he has to flee. So that takes 40 years. Then, from Exodus 3 all the way to the end of Exodus, and really all of Leviticus, and all of Numbers 1 through 10 is 2 years. Okay? Because you get the whole deal where you've got probably during the space of a year with all these various plagues, and then you've got them getting out, and by the third month, they're at Mount Sinai, and then Moses goes up and he gets the 10 words and all the rest of it that we'll talk about next week, and then he gets the instructions for, and it kind of says, and they built the tabernacle, and then you have all of the instructions in Leviticus. Then in Numbers 10, they leave to go up to the Promised Land, and Numbers 10 to 20, 10 to, what would it be, 10 to 21, is going to be the complaining and the murmuring that they do, and God says they're going to stay out here. So the end of Numbers is about 38 years or so, and Deuteronomy is a one-day speech by and large. Okay, so it's not like we have narrative all the way through. We have some constitutive documents that are going to come here as well. So anyway, that having been said, let's do a little bit now with looking at some of the detail. So Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to go through chapter 18 today. There's no easy place to draw the line. We could go through 19, we could stop at 15, but we'll go through this. So kind of hooking in with what we have in Genesis 50, we have kind of a new list of all of the sons of Jacob, or Israel, who have now gotten down into the land. So we have them listed about the 70 number, and then it says, now a new king rose who did not know Joseph. I've never figured out why, when Joseph died, why they wouldn't have gone and buried him the way they buried Jacob. He just says, when you go back up, take my bones with you. And that's going to be several hundred years later. So I have no idea why that doesn't take place. But so anyway, a new king rises. Notice it's a king, not a new pharaoh. And so we have some interesting names that are going to come along the way for this as well. And so by this time, they have become a numerous people, and the native Egyptians have enslaved them. Now, God had promised, I'm going to bring you out and take you into the land that I had promised. But what they're doing is they're building storage cities. So basically, they're building bricks out of clay and straw, from the clay that would be down around by the rivers, as that would have been swept down over the years. And the native Egyptians begin to say, we're kind of afraid of these folks. they may rise up and fight against us. If you want to see a little bit of a parallel, nowadays that there is still this effort to have a separate Palestinian state and a separate Jewish state, there are Palestinians who do live in Israel. And their birth rate is much higher than the Jews' birth rate is right now. So even though, they're certainly not going to be in their army, they can, within some decades, and I don't know exactly where it is right now, they can, outdo the population. They talk about some of those kind of things now as if we whites are the ones who are so great and important that people of color will soon be more of a majority in this country than the whites, the Caucasians from Europe who came here and had their descendants. And so time goes and things change. If we think it's not going to change, we're just foolish. And so nothing lasts all the time along the way. But they're getting to be a multitude. And I know it sounds horrific, but sometimes when people went into war, they would kill pregnant women. Why?
Cut down the population.
Cut down the next generation. Because if you kill a woman who's carrying a little baby boy,
You're killing two.
you're killing the next generation of soldiers too. Okay, and so they're not going to grow up and come to attack you. And so as horrendous as it is, and all of this stuff is horrendous to even think about, there are people who are going to say we want to keep them under our control. And there are always people who are going to say we're being kept down. We're not being given our chance to achieve our potential. Somebody else already has that, and they're keeping us from having what we want. Anytime you hear about how much more the CEO of a company makes than the standard worker, the standard wage, that same kind of thing is still going on. And those who would hate the rich because they must have money that I should have had. So in that sense, things are always going to be that way. And there's always going to be somebody making more than somebody else. Whether or not they're good at something or whether they've just sneaked or cheated or something like that. Among other things, I've been watching old episodes of Perry Mason. Every episode, that's about what it is. Somebody who's trying to make a buck off somebody else and get something cheap. And by now I think I could write some episodes. I've seen enough of them. But it's a diversion once in a while. So what do they say first of all? They tell the midwives, when a boy is born, in essence, wrap the cord around his neck and strangle him. Okay, so as you're helping that child be born, kill it so nobody notices.
Were the midwives Jewish or were
Yes,
they
no, they're
Egyptian?
Hebrews. They're Hebrews. Now,
Why would they obey that?
they didn't. They didn't.
Okay.
All right. Now, here's the deal, and this is just a kind of an overall historical thing. At this point, they're called Hebrews. Okay. We know the name Jacob. He's also given the name Israel. When they go out into the wilderness, sometimes they're called Hebrews, sometimes they're called Israelites. When you get to 1000 BC, the land is known as the land of Israel. In 960, when Solomon dies, so put Moses in somewhere around 1300, okay? Abraham around 2000, Moses around 1300, somewhere in there, on into the 1200s. David about 1000 BC. Okay, the end of the northern kingdom in 722, and the end of the southern kingdom in 586. Those are, if you can put those 5 dates together, you at least have some kind of a framework. So David's about 1,000 years before us, Abraham about 2,000 years before. But what happens now is as they come to the land, they're known as Israelites. After Solomon's death, when the northern and southern kingdoms split, you have Israel in the north, sometimes known as Ephraim, and down in the south you have Judah. Judahites or Judah. So Judah in the south, Israel in the north, until Israel gets destroyed, and then a prophet like Ezekiel, he'll talk about Israel as the whole crowd again, even though most of them live in the south. When they come back from exile in Babylon, The word Judahite, or Judah, Judaioi in Greek, is where the word Jew comes from. Okay? So Jew or Jewish would not have been used until essentially the 500s. So we wouldn't call them Jewish now, we'd call them Hebrew. And if you live in the land, what would you be called today if you're in the land of Israel? An Israeli. Okay, so Hebrew, Israelite, Judahite, Jew, Israeli. They each have their own time period when you would say it's appropriate to use this word now. So nobody would have ever said that Moses was an Israeli. And in other words, just the term wouldn't be used for that at that time period. So now they're Hebrews, and these would have been Hebrew midwives. And so you can hear the Jewish people laughing in later days when they would hear this story, because these two midwives say, huh, you know, and an old scholar, a scholar from 150 years ago that I'm reading, he says, well, the Arab populations of today, the women have easy time having birth, or giving birth. I don't know about that. I know when Matthew was born, all of the friends came to be with Kathy from Turkey, which is not quite the same area, but they all wailed with her all night, or the women all night.
Not a pretty picture.
So if you're wailing because you have birth pains, all of your lady friends come with you and they wail too. I won't tell you any more about this story, but I was in trouble. when I was told to leave her there in the hospital before she got in the private room the next morning, because the doctor wasn't going to come check her. But anyway, what it says here is, well, the Egyptian women, you know, they have very long labors. And those Hebrew women, baby pops out right away. So by the time they call us and let us know that the baby is going to be born, it's already born. So we can't strangle the kids. All right, and so one of the oldest jokes I remember from when I was in college, Willie Hassel told this one. He said, these two women were not the only midwives that they had. They were the heads of the labor union. It didn't cost me much then. It was free now, so you don't like it, that's too bad. Anyway, then they simply say, well, let's just throw all the baby boys in the Nile. Let the Egyptians come in and just throw all the baby boys in the Nile. That's not probably going to work real well, even back at that time. So chapter 2, we have a Levite man and his wife who have a child, and the daughter of Pharaoh here now. Notice chapter 1 talked about a new king. Now it's about a new Pharaoh, or about the Pharaoh whose daughter sees the baby after being hidden for 3 months. Now there's a funny little thing that you can only get in Hebrew on this one. What is the basket called that Moses is in? We all learned Moses in a basket, right?
No.
Huh?
Is it an ark?
An ark.
Oh.
The same word is only used 2 times, only 2 settings in the entire Bible. Noah's ark, where 8 are saved, and Moses' ark, where they make a nice little basket and put tar around the outside so that it won't sink. Now, you can't help but at least think somebody was saying there's a parallel here. And as Noah was the savior of all of those born of Adam, I mean, if that 8 hadn't been righteous, then what would have happened? Well, then there's nobody even to build the thing or to save all human beings. Well, so Moses is now saved in this little basket, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and raises him as an Egyptian. Now, the classic answer is that's where he would have learned how to write and do all sorts of other things, because he would have been trained as a scribe and whatever. That unlike all the others who probably never learned anything about writing, he would have had a chance to learn that. There is some, what they call, I think it's not pre-Sinaitic, but proto-Sinaitic writing from down by the copper mines down in Timna, down in the Sinai Peninsula from already around 15 or 1600 before Christ, which is seen as the earliest of the Hebrew kind of writing versus Egyptian kind of writing. So they think whoever was there, they had some knowledge of some alternate writing system that comes there. But so anyway, she saves this little guy. And then Miriam, who is the sister who's watching to see what happens, says, I know a lady who can nurse him. And takes the baby Moses right back to mama. And now Moses is protected by Pharaoh's daughter, and Moses' mother is protected by Pharaoh's daughter. And you have to assume probably not all of the baby boys got killed, but they were trying to see what they could do. And so once again, saved from a watery death by an ark. So when Moses grows up, now right in this chapter, he's got to go from age baby to age 40. We have his life, 40 years here, 40 years out in the wilderness by Reuel or Hobab or Jethro, names, family names and whatever. And then he comes back at age 80 to lead the people out, and he dies at 120. Some of those numbers come from elsewhere in the Bible, but that's roughly the 3/3. So by the end of chapter 2, we've got to have him already 40 years old, and he kills an Egyptian for striking a fellow Hebrew. And the next day, 2 Hebrew guys are fighting, and he says, come on, guys. And they say, what, are you going to kill one of us like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And now he knows he has to flee. So Charlie Heston looks pretty good when he's in the 10 Commandments. Moses would have been 80 years old. All right, and so even if he's in good health, he's not quite going to be as spry as what we see with Moses, with Charlie Heston leading everybody out of the deal. So when Pharaoh hears about it, then it says he decided he had to flee. So he flees to Midian, which is in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. Now the Sinai Peninsula is a triangle. You've got the Gulf of Suez to the left, you've got the Gulf of Aqaba to the right, and it meets and forms the Red Sea south of that. Okay, the Suez Canal is, you know, the little connection between the Mediterranean, it's pretty wide enough for the Abraham Lincoln to go through. I don't know if you saw the picture in the paper of the Abraham Lincoln going through to go to the Persian Gulf, the aircraft carrier, but it's wide enough for that to go through. I think we had to take a barge, didn't we, Kathy? I think we took a barge with our boat, with our bus. There was no bridge. I saw a bridge in the picture I saw in the paper, but I think we waited for a barge, and then that took us across it that early Sunday morning trip that we took. I don't. They've got a couple of them, a couple other ways now probably, but you have to have a pretty high bridge so that the ships, that the towers on the ships and everything are not going to knock the thing down. But anyway, so he goes into Midian, and he goes by an oasis. I was very interested in this when we were there in '84. I wondered, what does that land look like? It's mostly desert, but every once in a while there's enough of a depression, and how are you going to know where to look for water? You look for trees. So if you see a few trees somewhere, you can say there must be a depression where there's enough water to help those trees stay alive. And I was surprised. There were a lot of different little depressions along the way. Some major oases are going to be there as well. And you would often have religious people by an oasis, because they would see that as a gift from God, that God provides water in the midst of deserted territory. And so Moses goes to where there is an oasis, and so he stays there, and it says, an Egyptian helped us against the shepherds, as these girls talked to their father, who is the priest of Midian. It says, and he even drew water for us and watered the flock. Who does that sound like? Jacob. Well, Jacob went and drew the water for Rachel and got the water so that she could water her flock. So rather important kind of a deal. And so he says, where is the guy? Moses marries Zipporah, than one of the priest's daughters and stays there for 40 years. Now, my little bit of guesswork along this says when Moses was 40, God says, you think you're going to deliver these people from their bondage with your strength, right? I'm going to wait till you're 80. And you aren't going to be quite as much of a warrior at age 80 as you were at 40, so you'll know I'm doing the delivering. We find this kind of repeated in the Bible where the deliverance comes from God. Gideon, where he's got, I don't know, how many, 20, how many thousand is it? Anyway, he ends up with 300. And all they do is hold the torch and smash the pot. And the guys stab each other. So God says, I got to make sure you know that I'm the one who's doing it. Did that with Abraham and Sarah. You know now, when Sarah's having a baby, that God was the one who opened her womb. You tried for 75 years, and it didn't work. Now, when she's pregnant, you know that God was involved in this as well. Anyway, he stays there, and at the very end of chapter 2, it says that the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. We don't know anything else about what they did, but it's very clear in the Bible that because the people of Israel had obeyed all of the 10 Commandments and all of the laws of God, that God said, okay, now I'm ready to bring you out of slavery. Why do you smile there, sir?
Well, maybe you ought to write the letter before you read it.
Maybe you got to write the letter before you read it.
The law wasn't given yet.
Oh, that's right. That's right. They didn't have a law yet, did they? It's God's promise that's playing through, not that the people were good. Now, at most, they cry out in their bondage, and you might say they were remembering the covenant with Abraham from 400 years ago. But it can be simply, they're just hurting. We're hurting, and we wish that God would come and help us, or somebody would help us. We don't know anything about their theology at this point. But God's the one whose promise was over them, and so he's watching over them no matter what their circumstances are. And that's what salvation's about. It's not I qualify or I'm worthy before or after I'm chosen. They've been chosen under Abraham's time. And yet there was nothing about any law or rule that they were to follow. So, then chapter 3. Here we are with Moses serving, at this point it says his father-in-law Jethro. He takes the flocks beyond the wilderness and comes to Horeb. Now, if you go poke into the back of your Bibles and look at that triangular Sinai Peninsula, and we talk about Mount Sinai or here Mount Horeb, Jewish people have no concept, no suggestion about where exactly this mountain of God was. There are texts that would suggest that it was up in the very northeastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, if anywhere. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter one whit. It would be probably quite surprising. Kathy and I went down to St. Catherine's Monastery in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, where in 300 and something AD, Queen Helena, the mother of, oh goodness. Boy, the words just aren't coming so good anymore. Who's our, who starts the Christian?
Oh, Constantine?
Constantine. Got the word A in my mind. At the time of Constantine, his mother Helena went and she found where they supposedly said where Jesus was buried and where he was born and where he lived up in the Nazareth, and then went down there to St. Catherine's and found a high mountain down there. I figured out that to take 2 months to get there, which is what the text is going to tell us, they would have had to take all their flocks and herds and all those people at 6 miles a day. And 1 day of rest, but it would, without any water in most of the places, 6 miles a day, seems to me that'd be pretty hard to drive the flocks that much for 2 whole months. But there's nothing in the Bible that says where it was. So what later tradition would say, pretty much it would say northeast, because there are passages that say that the Lord came like a rushing wind. Habakkuk 3 will talk about this. And so all we need to know is that when Moses is quite elderly and is still shepherding, that God comes to him and says that he wants to deliver the people. So, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Now, Eric von Daniken and others say that somebody from another planet came and brought light bulbs. We're the God's astronauts, and that's where all that stuff came from. As I would say in Latin, dubito. I am dubious about whether that would be true. But there are people who are going to try and come up with all sorts of stuff. Was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you. Remember, I told you that's the phrase you're going to see all the way through the Bible. I am with you, therefore go. And this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Now, I would like the sign in advance, not later. He says, this is going to be a sign to you. After you lead them out, you'll come and worship me here. So, well, I'd like a sign before I go there. Something to show that something special is going on, as if the burning bush wasn't enough. And by the way, down at St. Catherine's Monastery, they have a bush that they call the thorn bush, the burning bush. They say this is the bush right here. It's a big, big plant.
It's the one that changes color.
What, Kathy?
It's the bush that changes colors, changes to red.
In the fall of the year,
Yeah.
okay. But it's got thorns on it as well. The word Sinai is the word for thorn in there as well. But anyway, so people are going to come up with all sorts of ideas of this, that, and the other thing. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh in Hebrew. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. Notice it's Jacob, not Israel. Other places we'll see the God of Israel, but here Jacob. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare that I will bring you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt, king here, and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, there, Fred, is your word Hebrews at this point, has met with us. Let us now go a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it. After that, he will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for jewelry of silver and of gold and of clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Normally, you plunder somebody after you have beaten them. Here, the women are going to be able to plunder their neighbors. Women didn't go to war. Women stayed home and hoped the men had come back. But here, the women are going to be able to plunder everything, and they're going to be handing them every bit of jewelry and all the heirlooms. Get out of here. Now, I am who I am. I cause to be what I cause to be. Nobody quite knows what to do with Ehya, Asher Ehya. Haya is the word in Hebrew for to be. Now, the second commandment in the way we number them says, you shall make no graven image. Right? You shall not make a graven image. You shall have no other gods. Or the second one in that listing. How do you make a picture of I am? You can make a picture of a storm god, or even death, or a wheat god, or a fish god, or something like that. It's pretty hard to make a picture of an intransitive noun. Doesn't go anywhere, doesn't do anything. And so God says, I am. Go tell them I am sent you. Now, what's the usual Hebrew way we say the name for God in the Old Testament, the personal name for God?
Yahweh.
Yahweh, okay? That's from those root letters. Some say it's a kal form, which means just to be. Some say it's from a hifil form, I cause to be. Nobody quite knows. But what we have here, do you know what happened to Yahweh along the way until he got to the United States in the 1700s? He disappeared. This is the way it worked. You shall not take the name of Yahweh, your God, Elohim, in vain. What's the best way never to say God's name in vain?
Not say it.
Not say it. So we get gol darn or gosh darn or golly and all sorts of other things just so we don't say the word God. All right? By the time of Jesus, they were already trying to make sure they didn't break that name. So instead of saying Yahweh, and later this comes into the Hebrew text as well, they said the word Adonai, which is the word for Lord or Sir, a general kind of word. It'd be the word Paul would have used, Adonai, when he says, who are you, Sir? Or who are you, Lord? Not in the sense of God, but just the word for Sir. And so the word Adonai was always read and pronounced that way when they saw the word Yahweh in the Hebrew text. Between the 4th and the 6th centuries AD, there were scholars who designed little dots and little lines to represent different letters of the alphabet, or different vowels. And so every time they saw the word Yahweh, they put the vowels for Adonai there. Because they said, we know how we read it. Well, people who began to study Hebrew in Germany and in England, Germany particularly, during the Reformation era and a little bit before that, they didn't know the trick. So they thought that's what the name was. So Yahweh and Adonai becomes Yehovah. The consonants from Yahweh, the vowels from Adonai, becomes Yehovah. And so they read the consonants from one word, the vowels from another one, and they came up with Jehovah. That's where Jehovah comes from. It was never known that way in the ancient world. The closest you can get is in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Sometimes they translated it with vowels, and so you see the vowels in the Septuagint of what they would have pronounced it like when they translated that or transliterated it into Greek. So, it used to be a lot of fun for me. Every once in a while, when I was interim pastor over at Jehovah, I would say, well, good morning, Jehovah Witnesses, or Jehovah's Witnesses, because we're witnesses to Yahweh. And there were people who got a big fight over there back in the 90s, I think, trying to change the name of the church because they said, we're not getting members because of the word Jehovah, that they think we're Jehovah Witnesses. I don't believe that for a nickel. The Holy Spirit brings whom he will, and when you hear the gospel, you hear the gospel. And if you ever get into Jehovah and look up in the ceiling, you can read Jehovah one way and Yahweh another way, that they have the vowels positioned, so you have the 4 consonant letters, and then the vowels kind of squiggled around, so you can read both Yahweh and Jehovah up there in the ceiling above the altar. But Yahweh now versus the generic word for God, Elohim, or El. Okay, so that's just the word anybody would use to talk about God or a deity, and Elohim is actually a plural, which can refer to gods or to the true God. The shortened version of that is El, E-L, like Israel, Elijah. My God is Yahweh. So J-A-H would be the short version of this. We see a lot of that around. So Elijah, anytime you have an E-L-I, that little I on the end of it is the word for my, a preposition that they put my God as one word. And so you'll see that. So sometimes you'll see the name Yah. So Jeremiah would be with the word I-A-H. Any I-A-H that you see in the Bible is just the word for Yahweh. So if we have the word Christopher, for example, that means one who carries Christ. Christofero. And Christo is the word for Christ, and Pharaoh or Pharaoh would be the word to carry something around. And so you see names kind of connected in there. Here he says, how am I going to describe who you are? Well, sometimes God's known as Yahweh in the Old Testament. They'd have known more about Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. But even that, after 400 years, that might get a little thin. And so he says they'll follow you, but there's some stuff that has to go first. So we have the land promise. That is the big promise from Genesis 12 on. I will give you a place of safety. I would suggest that that's an interim Garden of Eden, where God says, you're outside the garden, but I will protect you from all sides, and you will despoil those people who live there, who have turned away from me, and they're harsh with each other. At this time already, the late Bronze Age, as it's called, just before the Iron Age, which begins about the time of Moses here. So bronze is a much easier metal to be able to process and use. Copper and tin make bronze, and but it's not as hard. So if you're using a plow, it's harder to be able to plow with something that's copper or bronze as it is if you're going to be using some iron or something like that. And already they think that up in Turkey, in eastern Turkey, is where they would have had the Pittsburgh of the day, where they learned the process for processing iron. Kathy and I were up for a funeral that I did up in the Arrowhead, and I think there's something like 27 steps of processing the metal before they get it into the pellets that they send out toward Pennsylvania, where we're now. So it's quite an extended process to be able to do that. We're just getting at the beginning of the Iron Age here, but the late Bronze Age, we have huge Canaanite cities, and with some of them with very, very thick walls because they have to protect themselves against somebody else. You build a wall basically to protect your grain and then whatever other monies you would have. Temples were the bank. The Holy of Holies was where you'd put your money. Solomon, when he builds the temple in Jerusalem, nails gold to the walls, and then he makes some shields because he's got more gold than he can nail up on the walls. It would fall down. There was so much of it. But that wasn't just decoration. That was where you kept your loot. And so they had that special building where they would kind of protect all the stuff, the vault and whatever. So here, God says you're going to despoil them. That's where they would have gotten all the precious metals from that they'll later use to build their tabernacle. Next thing that we have, before I'll do a couple more chapters, we'll take a break. First of all, yep.
At the time when God was telling Moses about the promised land, the Hebrews had forgotten that they already had this land promised to them during the time of Abraham, right?
I don't know. If they had believed it was promised to them, they'd certainly been around in Egypt too long to think they'd ever get it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we plain don't know because there's nothing between Genesis 50 and Exodus 1. for 350 years.
That's why they never bellyached about it and said, hey,
They
there's a
did,
land you
they
promised
did,
us.
they did, well, we just don't know. It says they cried out to God in their bondage. Now, this is a very interesting thing to learn about prayer. Okay, we pray and we think God's going to fix something right away. God, would you please fix this for me? So they cry out in their bondage, and it takes 40 years from that point to even get toward the edge of the promised land. They're crying out their bondage. First, Moses has to be born, technically, because they're already oppressed then, and then has to grow up and has to get thrown out and has to be gone for 40 years, and then that crowd didn't get in the promised land anyway. They don't get in the promised land until 120 years after they cry out in their bondage. Come on, God, I ask you to do something, fix it now. And so we think if we pray hard enough, God will do it right now. He says, I'll take care of all of it in my own good time. But we got to learn from that a little bit about that prayer says, I lay it on the Lord's heart, and then I know I don't have to carry it because He's carrying it, and then I can be free of it. But Kathy and I had a really nice experience with a church service for our district convention up in Brainerd Monday night. It's kind of like the highlight of the whole thing for us. And I got there one time when it was just me going up, and I had taught a class, and I got in to the church service about the time of the sermon. And about the time I was coming in, I don't know who the pastor was, but he said, when you cast your burden on the Lord, cut the line. Because what people do is they cast their burden on the Lord and then reel it back in. So, oh, I got all these problems. After you've said to the Lord, here's my problems, they're not yours anymore, they're His. So, we don't have to keep on saying, hey, God, don't you remember what I said? Don't you remember I want this to be done? You cast it on, and then you're free, which is why after we pray and we go up to the Lord's Supper, we go there, we've offered our prayers of thanks. We've offered to Him all of the burdens that we carry. We've offered our financial offerings and thank you. We've heard that we're forgiven and restored and renewed, and we're welcomed to a meal. Everything is okay then. But then, if we go up and we say, oh, I've got to carry all these burdens again. No, you don't. And we lay them on His shoulders so that then we've got time for other people. If I can't fix it, I give it to God. However He does whatever He does, it's not mine anymore. It's not mine alone. And often when we share our burdens with one another, we're sharing that burden as well. But finally, we all pray together and say, God, lift the burden of this off. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but we leave that in your hands. And so, in essence, God says, I heard you, but I'm not going to fix it today or tomorrow. There could have been grandkids, great-grandkids, before some of this stuff ever got answered. So if I say, well, God didn't answer my prayer, then I have put the burden on Him. I not only want you to fix it, but I want you to fix it now. And that's what is in so much of our world history. I want this fixed now. If I have to go to war to do it, I'll go to war to do it. I can't wait for anything. I have to have it all resolved now. So anyway, God says, well, I'll give you a couple of little hints. So his staff becomes a snake, and then he picks it up and it turns back into a staff. His hand turns leprous and then is healed. And water is poured out on the ground and becomes red. And the Nile, of course, is going to be blue. And then the water is all red. So he's got some little things that he can show them, show the people. So, as Fred was commenting to me before we started today, Moses is a scaredy cat.
He's a what?
A scaredy cat. I don't want to go. They're not going to listen to me. Comes one excuse after another. He's got a later guy in the Bible like him, Jeremiah. Versus Isaiah, who says, Lord, here am I, send me, send me. Okay, go tell everybody they're going to die. Until they're almost all gone. But Jeremiah, Moses, they're hesitant about it. They don't know what to do. I'd put Ezekiel in the Isaiah category. They're kind of ready that they can go ahead and do whatever God calls them to do. But God says to him, your brother Aaron, who's back in Egypt, he will become your mouthpiece. You talk and he'll put it into the right kind of words. And whether he really couldn't do this stuff or was just trying to prevaricate and see if he could find some other way out of it, you see, now it's going to be God giving the victory, not him. And so when there's a part in Deuteronomy 32 that says, when I see that all their strength is gone, then I will come and I will deliver them. And so the deal is, God says, when you know you don't have anything you can do anymore, then I'll be able to kick in and do it. But we have a kind of a very small idea of what we need to ask God about. When do we usually have a special voters meeting in our churches? There's two answers that I would expect you'd come up with.
When you need a pastor?
When you need a pastor,
A new building.
new building, or any money trouble.
Money, yeah.
Okay, they're going to foreclose on us by Wednesday if we don't do something. How many of you have ever been to a voters meeting where they said 10 people died without Christ within a mile of the building this last month, and we need to get out there and tell the good news? Why don't we have special voters meeting for that? But for that, no. You know, if the joint's going to close, then we better have a special voters meeting. Or if we need someone standing up there to hand us the bread and the wine, then we need a special voters meeting. But if people are dying without Christ, ho hum. You know, they made their choice. Lord says, I died for all of them. Go tell them. Go out and look for them. And we have a very hard time doing that. And that doesn't mean there isn't resistance out there. But he says, I've overcome the world. So there's ways in which you can help people who don't know Christ to know him. That's what our primary prayer is when we say, thy kingdom come. Our health is, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Okay? Or it's give us this day our daily bread. The will of God is that his name is hallowed and his kingdom comes. Our daily bread, Luther says, is everything needed for this life. So we say, well, if it's the will of God, this person should be healed. The will of God is everybody's healed eternally by being saved. And the daily things, that comes in later. So the mission is what's important in that first part of the Lord's Prayer. So anyway, Moses is trying to get out of all this. And sometimes Moses will be alone, sometimes with Aaron. Sometimes they see Pharaoh, sometimes they don't. So it gets kind of complicated a little bit. But Jethro says it's okay for Moses to go back. Now, I'm going to leave it up here. And when we get back from our break, I'd like to ask and talk about what hardening of the heart is all about. Okay? And so we'll do that right afterwards. I'm not going to spend much time with all the plagues. I want to spend some time yet with the Passover, and those would be the two big things yet for the rest of the time. So, easy question. What does it mean that God hardens hearts?
Let you have your own way.
Lets you have your own way. Okay?
I thought we hardened our own because God wouldn't want to do that to us.
We do our own because God wouldn't want to do that to us. Okay. Who else wants to wade in on this one?
Goes against everything that you want.
Yeah, goes against everything you want. Why would God harden our hearts? Well, the first little thing that I will tell you that is from Martin Luther. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was some I don't know, monk or something, lived some years ago. He said, the sun in the summertime softens wax and hardens concrete. So it depends on what is inside or what the makeup is of the individual. Now there are 3 different words for harden in the book of Exodus. Okay, from make heavy to make solid or something like that. The deal, my best example, these are real kids, is the story that I heard one night when my elder Clarence Schrader came into the elders meeting back in Michigan. Clarence is laughing. He says, oh, Hans and Peter were fighting again. Now, Hans and Peter and my son, or our son Matt, were in the same class. And Clarence Schrader was the bus driver, as well as being a farmer. And Clarence is laughing. He says, those 2 guys were going at it in the back of the bus. So I stopped the bus. I went back there. I grabbed them each by the collar, and I said, say you're sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. One problem. They lived kind of across the Ridge Highway from each other, so they got off at the same stop. What do you think was happening in the rearview mirror? They were duking it out. He didn't cure their problem. He hardened them in the way of thinking that they were in. So it's not that Pharaoh is a nice man, and God comes in and turns the screw just enough to make him all of a sudden to be a nasty man. What's in Pharaoh's heart is, I am God here. And Yahweh says, no, you're not. I'm God here. No, you're not. It says it 10 times. Now, if Pharaoh had said, I'm beyond my element, the Israelites could have been left to go. Now, there's a little bit of lying that goes on here. We just need to go out for 3 days out in the wilderness. And all these different solutions that come along, they were going to leave and not come back. Now, you have to be pretty confident of yourself if someone goes out on strike and you say, good, we'll get somebody else. I think the biggest example I can think of that was Reagan with the air traffic controllers in the late 80s. He let them all go. It's all right, we'll start over with somebody else. Normally you say, well, here's all the people that we trust, and we have to keep them right in there. There's a little bit of that going on with China right now. Are we going to just let ourselves be led around, or is there something that has to be done differently? And so we'll see what happens, and see how that all unfolds. But two countries are hardening in their positions because they each think they're right. And we know we're right, so I didn't realize it, but a lot of the business in China is owned by the generals. So enlightened self-interest says they don't want their companies getting squeezed. So you hear a couple little things like that. Aha! Aha, that's what's going on there. Well, so Moses is going to come, and on the way, so I'm not going to go into a lot more on this with hardening of the heart. Whether it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart, or it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, it's the same thing. All right, it's I am learning more about the position that I hold. So sometimes we might say, well, I don't really know what I think about that. And you think about it for a little while and say, I think I know better what I think about it now, and I don't like the way this or that's going. And so something that might not even cross our path, after a while, we say, no, that's important. That I'm willing to stand for. Christians are frustrated with the way things go in our country or in our world. And they say, well, this is not the way we want it to be. And the more we see things happen, the more we say, that's not what I want to have happen. So whether or not we can get it solved, we become more and more convinced of our way of thinking, whatever that happens to be. So on the way, we have this strange passage. There are a few passages in the Bible that are just weird. So Genesis 6, the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. Genesis 32, Jacob wrestling with God or the devil or an angel or whatever. And this one where God almost kills Moses, apparently. The best people can come up with is kind of a guess that they had not been practicing circumcision, and that Moses' son was not circumcised, and that he gets circumcised, and that otherwise God would wipe him out. But it's a weird text.
I read it and it didn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, we need to recognize that God is not a patsy. He gives certain things for us that he calls us to follow, and he doesn't say, well, take a vote on it and see if you like it. There are some things where he says, this is the way I built it, this is the way it's to work, and for some reason with the covenant from Genesis 17, that all of the children are to be circumcised on the 8th day. We'll see that happens again, well, we won't see it in this course, but in Joshua, where they have a circumcision at Gilgal after they get into the land of promise. So they weren't always practicing all of these things. Don't read in that all of these Israelites were going to Sabbath school and learning all the Bible stories and remembering it all. We have nothing to go on of what they knew or didn't know. Maybe when Moses says Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they know what's going on. But I don't know the names of my relatives from 400 years ago. And even with a society and a culture where people would pass their names down, a lot of this stuff gets kind of a little bit mixed up along the way. And they cry out in their bondage. It doesn't say they cry out because they wanted to go back to the other land. So Moses is going to have a bit of a time with this. And so anyway, God says Pharaoh is going to be resistant to what you have to do. Yeah, Dale?
What do we know about techniques that God used to talk to Moses and the people?
Nothing.
Except that it was a voice, that somehow they recognized it was God's voice,
There-
not someone else's.
Yeah. There are some times where it talks about a vision, or it talks about a dream, or it just says God spoke to them. In Job and in Isaiah, there are a couple passages that talk about someone whose hair stands out on the back of their neck. They get kind of funny feeling about it, whether they're in a trance or whatever. Almost nothing is said. Almost nothing. Whether it's just a conviction that they have or whatever. Don't know. Don't know. It's just plain not there. Kind of the closest you can get in the New Testament is Jesus who hears, "You are my beloved Son, with you I'm well pleased." And the Spirit comes down like a dove. But, even in the garden, does Jesus get an answer? It says the angels came and ministered to him, but God doesn't crank down a loudspeaker and say, "Okay, son, I'll figure out another way. Just go on home and take a shower and I'll figure another way to get people saved." So even with Jesus, a lot of times it's, you don't know what's going about how the connection is there. It's a big question. There are some guesses, but nobody quite knows because not enough is in the text to tell us. So, yep.
I often wonder how it would be if Jesus was suddenly standing here. In Revelation, they talk about when God comes, we will fall down on our faces. I can't imagine what this is going to be like. I just can't imagine it.
Well,
When we see splendor, when we see holiness, what that's really going to be, when they heard that voice, I can believe that hair was standing up on your neck. I can, get the feeling in myself when I'm terribly frightened all of a sudden. You get that sensation that something is going on here.
yep.
That's not usual.
What's the first thing that you will know if Jesus were standing right here?
This is my last day on earth.
It's the end of the world. Because he says, the next time I see you, eternity begins, or the next stage of eternity. And all of those who see Jesus as he is will not go through the doorway of death. So a lot of us could escape dying. When Jesus returns, we're not going to die then. The first words that angels learn in Angels 101 is fear not. And I would imagine the first thing Jesus would say is fear not. And then he would say, come on, let's enjoy for all eternity. And so we will quickly get used to being in God's presence, and it's not a bad deal. Our fear would be, I'm in trouble. It would be the kind of fear when Dad walked over to Mr. Ortiz's house to ask about how that window got broken in the garage. and then Dad came back home. Then you know what fear is. But very quickly the fear will go away because we will have nothing to be afraid of. But if, let's say, it wasn't the end of the world, and Jesus just happened to step out of the rules and come to talk to us, what we would not know is that his death on the cross means our eternity. So even the 500 who saw him and all the disciples who saw him after the resurrection, they could see he's alive, but until eternity and the end of the world comes, none of us would be able to see that him standing there means we're going to live in all eternity and be freed from all of our sins. So in the Old Testament, I don't think we should think of Moses as, later it'll talk about when he goes up on the mountain that he's got a kind of a glow to him when he comes back down. And the people were afraid of that. But we ought not think that the prophets and most of these people were seen as anybody special. They thought of the Pharaoh as special. But this little piddly 80-year-old guy and his 83-year-old brother, he's nothing. And they would have seen him that way. So, and Jesus on earth, they didn't get it. I've mentioned about how I would have liked to have been at the tent when Abraham comes back and says, I almost killed Isaac. God told me to go kill him, and I didn't. And how when the brothers come and say to Jacob, by the way, we sold that kid that we didn't like, and now he's second in command down in Egypt. Another one I would enjoy on Judgment Day would be to see what happens to Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate on Judgment Day when they stand before Jesus. And whoa! And that may not be such a good turnout for the event. But to look at him just as just a nothing and just another guy to crucify. Pilate probably never thought of it a week later. He wouldn't have known that his name is still being talked about 2,000 years later. That was just one of many. He had uprisings all the time, had to keep people in line. But if it was the end of time, when Jesus stands here, that's one thing. If he just came in the room, no matter how much he says he loves you and he's going to take you to be with him, you can't prove it. You still live by faith. And so to try to justify our faith on the basis of any events, or the snake, or the leprosy, or the blood, that's really, God doesn't convert through miracles. Miracles may attract attention, but he does it through touching hearts. And a lot of people have said, well, if I just saw a couple of miracles, then I could believe better. No, I don't want any miracles, because then I'm going to be hanging on, prove this to me. It is completely, absolutely by faith and not by works or not by sight. And yet he says, well, I'm holding on to you, so that's okay. So quit worrying about it that you don't have more faith. I think the worst thing that Christians can do is try to get more faith. You can't get any more faith than the day of your baptism, when you were given eternal life and peace with God. And he says, I'm holding on to you, that's enough. And everything else that we try to do to get more proof about it is actually going in the other direction and using our head instead of just saying, well, he said it's true, I'll live on the basis of that, and I can't prove a single thing is true. Nothing that I've ever taught can I prove. And people could say, well, yeah, but it's in the Bible. Well, prove the Bible. Well, you can't prove that. No, can't prove anything. And so the Christian church marches to tell a story that it can't prove to anybody. And as soon as it starts trying to, you'll feel closer to Jesus if you take this Bible study, or you'll grow in faith. And I've heard this promised about a lot of things in the church. You do this program and you'll be a better Christian. I can't be a better Christian. I can't be more forgiven than I was the day I got baptized. And so those kinds of things, sometimes the things that seem to be the brightest help are really the biggest problems. And so if we say, well, God, if you just heal this person, then I'll know you're there. Then he says, boy, am I going to do that healing now or not? Because I don't want them to be waiting for me to prove something to them. And he does what he does, but it's not always on our timetable. So I have no idea. And at least I've done a little bit of reading about it and found no answers that are satisfying to anybody about any of it, the scholars included. They all say, don't know. And it's certainly not the same thing in all the different ways. So Moses and Aaron go and speak, and they say to the Pharaoh, we want to go off and worship. And the taskmasters say, they got time to think about going somewhere else. We're going to take away the straw. They have to go get their own straw and still make the same number of bricks. And so instead of getting better, it gets worse. Now all of Israel is angry with him. Now you went and you made things worse. It wasn't bad enough before. Now you're making things worse for us. And politicians in general, if they really want to try and make something better, they got to change the way the ship is going. And there are going to be a lot of people grumpy about this or that or the other thing. So Wait till we look at whatever gets solved about Social Security someday. The guy who solves that better be in the last month of his presidency. Because that's going to be a tough one. Okay, and boy, we're not going to take that one. So anyway, Moses then complains to God. I cannot help when I see this of thinking of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. And poor Stan Laurel, oh, Ollie, oh, and he's always, oh, I don't know what to do. This went bad, that went bad. Hardy is bashing him over the head for it. But he's always like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know how to get out of it. So here's poor wimpy old Moses. Now he knows he has no power. And now even the people he went to help don't want him to help. So nothing new under the sun, even with God. Even when God says, I've got something good for you, but you may go through a little bit of trouble along the way. So chapter 6, God appears to him again. And this is another one of those great chapters that talk about the I am. So I want to read a little bit of this. The Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand he will let them go. By a hand he will drive them out of his land. God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, which the text says El Shaddai down here. But now, by my name, the Lord, or Yahweh, I did not make myself known. But now I'm making myself known that way. So I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they resided as aliens. I have heard also the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are holding as slaves, and I've remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession, or for a possession. I am the Lord. I'm Yahweh. Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their cruel slavery. And then God says, now go start talking to Pharaoh. And he says, I can't talk very well. And we get almost an instant replay of some of this stuff from chapter 2. You look at chapter 2 and chapter 6. In some ways, they're parallel things about I am the Lord. But the families are listed then again along the way about all who these people were. And in chapter 7, Moses becomes God, so the earthly spokesman on earth for God, and Aaron becomes his prophet or spokesman. Okay, so Moses says it however he says it, and Aaron goes and spruces it up. He's the speechwriter who puts it into a form then. And we're told Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. We ought not think that unbelievers are sitting around waiting to be saved. Unbelievers have their own views that are directly opposed. And when we see things in the world that we don't like, there are people who are just bent, I was going to say hell-bent, but bent on their way of thinking, their way of doing something. And we need to talk to someone's weakness, not their strength. So we need to love people enough and care for them enough that they can say, here's where I'm hurting. When we try and bash them away at what is their high point, and that doesn't mean it's always going to work, but if we're going to bash away at where they feel they're strong, then we're not going to get anywhere. And so evangelism is not just go up on someone's porch and tell them in 2 minutes about Jesus and then expect they're going to be hopping up and down. It's when they recognize things aren't going well in my life and things are wrong and I don't know what to do about it, then to be there and hold them and care for them as you tell them the good news. Pharaoh did not get converted. Pilate did not get converted. Annas and Caiaphas did not get converted. We ought not think that God says, I have to make everybody what I want them to be. He didn't get forced. Instead, so first of all, we have the staff turn into a snake. Well, the magicians do that too. The water turns to blood and the fish die. Well, that's not a very good one. The magicians do the same. I don't know if they had some other water around the side or something like that. I have a very hard time remembering the 12 tribes according to who was their mothers. Which ones were the children of which ones. For some reason, I've never been able to get that to stick, and I can never remember the 10 plagues in order. I know the last one is the plague of the firstborn, and I recognize all the others, but I can never remember what the order is on it. So it's a good thing I have a cheat sheet in front of me here that I can read. The third one is the frogs. So the first ones, the magicians can do those as well. And then Pharaoh says, well, take them away, please. And then the gnats from the dust. And, the fleas, You ever stay in a flea bag motel? The fleas that are there. And it says the magicians couldn't do that one. So there are wicked powers that have control over things. We can't figure out what that's all about. I don't know about that either. But then the flies, where it only comes upon the Egyptians and the Israelites are free. The Hebrews are free at that point. That's a pretty interesting one. So you're going to begin to get some noticing that some things are different and not everything happening to everybody. And then they come up with this kind of lame story that we have to sacrifice far away from the land because you people don't like sacrifices. And so we have to go away so you're not irritated about it. And then after the flies disappear, then Pharaoh changes his mind. Kathy and I had these experiences with flies when we were on our archaeological dig in southern Israel. We would take a bus, or a truck really, there were maybe, 15, 20 of us, and they would take along hard-boiled eggs for our second breakfast. Second breakfast is about 9:30 in the morning. The first breakfast is about 5:30, and about 9:30 you have some yogurt and some eggs. And just a little bit of bouncing of the truck to get out to our dig site from Beersheba where we were living, the eggshells would crack a little bit. And it's so dry that they would put the eggs out on plates for us underneath our little covering thing, and there might be 500, 600, 700 flies all around on the tables, walking all around trying to get the moisture out of those eggshells. And you swatting all these things, It was not a very pleasant kind of a scenario for it. But these flies, they're so dry that they'll get any moisture anywhere they can. And so to have the whole country full of those is going to be something that, obviously is going to be a problem, and then goes away, and then he changes his mind. Well, then there's a livestock pestilence in chapter 9, which only happens to Egypt. Then he throws some soot up in the air, and it becomes fine dust and causes boils for people. And Moses says to Pharaoh, see, God is showing his power. Now, if you think a certain way, and you think there can't be any other God, or there's not a God more powerful than me because I'm Pharaoh in Egypt, no matter what happens, you can come up with a different solution for it. I'm always amazed when, with Ahab and Jezebel, when it doesn't rain for 3 years or whatever, and then it rains, and instead of Jezebel saying, your God is more powerful than my God Baal, I got to quit worshiping my God, when Elijah kills the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, she says, I want his head off by tomorrow. And they said, well, the only reason it didn't rain was because Elijah somehow hid the eyes of Baal and Asherah from seeing what was going on. And then when he goes and kills them, if you kill him, then the covering will go off, Baal will see once again, and we'll get rain again. She doesn't break out of her system for nothing. Of course, later she gets thrown out of the window by the people who follow up and later take over Jehu and his crowd. But it doesn't mean that a miracle is something that's going to change somebody's ideas. And so Pharaoh even more gets hardened into his view. I was right and you were wrong. So then you have the heavy hail, and they were warned about that one. And if you don't get your animals in, then they're going to die, and that happens. And then the flax and the barley are ruined. Some people say that this happens over the space of about a year. Every one of these, except the 10th plague, is a plague that happens one way or another. Now, the blood red is probably red clay clay with a lot of iron in it that could get washed into the water and it wouldn't be easy. And these other plagues that come in, they're all known in nature, but not all at once, and not that they as quickly would disappear. But the flax and the barley are ruined. Barley matures earlier than wheat. So in Israel, the barley harvest happens, first of all, right at Passover at our Easter time, and the wheat later, it matures about the time of, toward the time of Pentecost, a couple months later. So anyway, the Pharaoh hardened his heart, or was hardened once again. Chapter 10, God says, I hardened his heart. I let him recognize even more I'm in charge and he's not. And when does somebody get the angriest? They start really flailing when they know they're not able to control something. So anyway, then we get to the locust plague, where Moses and Aaron are talking to Pharaoh about that, and the officials counsel Pharaoh, hey, get rid of those guys. Get them out of here. We don't need them anymore. And then Moses says, yeah, I want to take everybody. And Pharaoh says, no, you're not going to take everybody. He says, I want to take everybody. And then after the locust, then Pharaoh says, oh, I sinned. I did something wrong here. And then he changes his mind again. So he does that several different times. So sometimes Moses and Aaron are there together, sometimes they just announce that something is going to happen. The 9th plague is the plague of darkness. That one I can usually remember as well for some crazy reason. But the plague of darkness, I'm told that the thickest darkness you could probably find would be in caves. And that even if you light a light in a cave, it really will not necessarily, if the cave is big enough, it's not going to be able to light the whole thing. And that's about as dark as you can get. You can get something similar if the lights aren't on and you're in some of these real long tunnels. But by and large, the darkness where they don't even know where they are and how to get their way around. And again, Pharaoh says, no, 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 no. And God keeps saying, you're not in charge of any of this stuff. And we can put money together to take care of hurricanes and floods and all these kinds of things. We can't stop them. You know, I keep thinking, why can't somebody go and stop a hurricane? And, you know, I just don't have any concept that something could have that much power in it, that you can't just chop it or stop it, you know, or say, oh, we don't want you. Why don't you go a different direction? And so we all recognize our weaknesses in the natural things. The best we can do is maybe not put our houses into places where it's most dangerous. But that doesn't always work either. So God finally says that he is going to use the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn. Remember that Isaac is spared. But maybe, and this is a guess, there were cultures in the ancient world where the firstborn was offered up. And we give you the firstborn, God or deity, and will you give us some more following? With the firstborn of animals, that would happen, the firstborn male, where you would be giving the first or the best to God, which is what first fruits giving is about. You give that back to God, acknowledging he will be able to give more. So then we have the midnight, everybody is going to, all the firstborn in Egypt will die. Dale, I'm very glad to congratulate you on being the firstborn. I will be spared, and so unless you get some blood quick and put it on the door.
Sad day.
Huh?
Sad day.
So anyway, so Israel will be spared. Pharaoh says no, he's not going to listen. And so I'm not going to take as much time as I could with reading all of this, but we're going to get into some more in Leviticus about what sacrifices are, and I'll allude to it a little bit more there. But you can have a sacrifice for sin, or you can have a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And words are often used in more than one way, so you can't always say, well, this is the word, it always means this. But is this a sacrifice? The Passover, is it a sacrifice? Obviously, this is where we get our Holy Communion practice from,
When you
right?
take it away, it isn't a sacrifice.
I'm sorry?
When you take it away, it's not a sacrifice.
What do you mean when you take it away?
God took the firstborn. They didn't offer them
No,
up.
I mean the animals, the lambs that are killed.
Oh, that,
The other sacrifice would be where God says, you don't want to give me a replacement for that firstborn, I'll take the firstborn. But how about the animals here? Is this a sacrifice?
Well, it was acceptable by God.
What do you mean it was acceptable by God?
Well, when the people themselves had to sacrifice.
I'm talking about right here.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about those more in Leviticus in 2 weeks.
that's a meal on the sign, isn't it?
Well, it's a meal. See, it's a meal. Now, whole burnt offerings, they would burn the whole thing up. Peace offerings, they would give a portion to God and then keep the rest for themselves. And we'll see that in 2 weeks. This is simply a meal. Now, people in that time didn't eat much meat. You had your sheep for wool. You had your goats for milk. And so this isn't, the reason I'm asking this is because when we have our Holy Communion service, and people look at this very differently, and so I know people have had Passover meals, Seder meals, and looked at that on Maundy Thursday, and Kathy and I participated with one over at Bethlehem many years ago, where just the two pastors, myself as the assisting pastor and Bob Krieger, and our families sat up in front and we talked through the meal and what would go on with it for the congregation. I know you've had Seder meals here, and I don't know, for a lot of years or just once in a while? Okay, some congregations have that regularly, but this is not really a sacrifice like Jesus was sacrificing himself to die on the cross. He picks out a couple parts of it. So it's okay to understand what was a Passover meal like. But Passover and communion are not the same thing. Okay? Because, first of all, and that's why the first question I asked you, what did they do to get down into Egypt? If they were sacrificing for their sins, they would have burned the animal up. And if this Seder meal, this Passover meal, were because of their sins, God's delivering them from other trouble. All right? So it's not you sinned and now you offer this animal's life up to God in sorrow for your sin. They're not being called sinners here at all. They're the oppressed ones. So this is not really quite the same thing as Easter, okay, where we're delivered from our eternal death. Here, it's delivered from someone stronger than they were, and they were innocent, at least of becoming slaves and all that. In the New Testament, with Jesus dying on the cross for us, he says, Dad, they're all guilty, put me to death instead, and let them go free, which is different than this. Let my people go. They're innocent here. They're not being punished down in Egypt. They're being protected and saved till they become a great people. And so they take the blood, they put it in the doorposts. This is where you get what's called a minyan, which is 10 people. They figure about 10 people to eat an animal. Okay? And the last night of our archaeological dig, they actually worked with a Bedouin sheikh near us out by Tel Mashosh. They dug a hole in the sand, they hollowed it out, they took 4 posts, they put cyclone fence over it, they built a fire underneath and then threw hunks of meat on that cyclone fence, nice big hunks of meat, and salted them heavily. And so we bought 2, I think it was goats, and had a really nice last meal out there by our dig site in early September. It was just before the Olympic massacre. We ended up going through and in Munich the day after they had stopped everything. And so we were in Israel at that time and then flew into Munich as the bodies were being flown out.
We just missed each other.
Yeah,
I was there.
You were at the Olympics too?
I was not at the Olympic, I was in Munich.
Okay, well you didn't call me.
No.
You didn't let me know.
You didn't have your cell phone.
I had it turned off. But anyway, so About 9:30 at night, the moon came up, full moon. It was one of the most gorgeous, wonderful evenings. And so, I mean, people will have meals like that and enjoy that. This is food for the road. And the bread, they would have been just in harvest time here in the spring, so they would have made unleavened bread, not even having time to put the yeast in to get it to rise. So they're getting themselves some provisions to go out into the wilderness. Shepherds did that in the spring of the year every year from time immemorial. And the Egyptian shepherds, apparently, and I say apparently because I can't quote for you where it's from, but I believe there is some documentary evidence for it, that they would kill animals and give them to the gods. And say, please, when we're out in the wilderness, don't kill any more of them. Here, we're going to feed you first. An idea of giving the gods blood so the gods could keep staying alive. And then we'll maybe talk about that sacrifice stuff a little bit more. But anyway, the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, the angel of death passed over them and did not hurt them. And so from that time on, the Jewish people would remember. And remember, it's a household meal. Sometimes they had Passover in Jerusalem, and sometimes they made it a big deal where many, many millions of people sometime came. And Josephus talks about this at the time of Jesus. And after that, no wonder they were worried there was going to be a revolt when a lot of people got together. But here, and for most Jewish people, it is a family household meal. So you can be a faithful Jew and never go to synagogue. Okay, you do your own participating things at home. So anyway, the people of the firstborn of Egypt are to be redeemed. They talk about that later, where they will give an animal instead of it, and the Levites come up here, where all the Levites become the replacements for the firstborn. So in the ancient world, if they follow the old pattern, Dale would have become a priest. The firstborn would become a priest and be given over to God, as Samuel kind of was. But for most of them, the Levites, so you would offer a sacrifice, and so when Jesus' parents go to the temple, it's not to circumcise them on the 8th day, but on the 40th day, I think it would have been, when they would be coming to offer a firstborn offering, to let him go back to be part of his family instead of be dedicated to the Lord. Anyway, Israel is then ready to go out and go into the land. As they leave, God says, now wheel around, and they get caught between Pharaoh, who's chasing after them, and a body of water. All right, and so we all know this as called the Red Sea. I mentioned the Red Sea technically is way, way, way down south of the Sinai. In Hebrew, this is called Yam Suf, which means the Sea of Reeds, papyrus reeds. It's marshy land. You don't need much water to stop you from getting somewhere. So there are various suggestions about, some look at the Bardawil Peninsula, which is a little narrow spit of land that's along into the Mediterranean a little bit. All that happens here is God says, I'm going to let you know you're stuck, and then I'm going to blow the water back, and you're going to go through, and then Pharaoh's going to be drowned, and you will not have to lift a finger. That's what Yahweh's war is all about. God says, I will win the victory, and you do nothing. Now, in that sense, the water being blown back by God and then getting Pharaoh's host is exactly what he does on the cross. We didn't do anything to get our salvation, and never can. And so if somebody says, well, you have to show it now by your good works, no. We can respond and say thank you, but it's not the quality of our good works that gets the job done. It's what he did as the firstborn. God did not spare his only begotten son, but gave him up for us all. So we looked at that thing with Isaac. So here, the people right away are saying, oh, we should have stayed in Egypt. Now we're in trouble. Didn't take them very long to be saying God's at fault. And so Moses says, well, God is going to fight for you. He's going to be on your side. And then they go through, and then Pharaoh and his host are drowned. One of the ancient songs here, the Song of the Lord, that God has won the victory here. The Lord has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has cast into the sea. He has become my salvation. So salvation is someone who gets us out of trouble that we can't get out of on our own. Okay? When you know you can't get out of trouble and somebody else has to save you, then you recognize what has been done. A lot of people don't know they're in trouble. And so they don't need a savior who's going to tell them what to do afterwards. Then who is like you? Mi kamoka. Who is like you among the gods? And so sometimes the Bible will assume what other people talk about. There's other gods, other deities, whatever, but says, none of them compare to you. No man works like him. No God works like that. And so the song of praise here is saying it's all what God himself has given. And then Miriam sings a song as well about the horse and rider cast into the sea. And then the people start complaining. And they're going to complain, first of all, about bitter water as they get out there. They don't have any water to drink. The word mara, M-A-R-A-H, is the word for bitter. Then, again, they're already saying here, and they'll say it again in Numbers 10 to 21. We'll have an instant replay, a lot of these grumblings and gripings and complainings. We should have stayed where we were. It was better then than it is now. And all you have to do is look at the news tonight about the China and U.S. thing, and you're going to hear the same thing. We should have just left well enough alone. Even though well enough may not have been real good for us. Just the kind of thing, that's not what I wanted. They're told about manna now, and on the 6th day, gather 2 jugfuls of it, and it won't get rotten, otherwise it'll get rotten for you, and they eat that for the next 40 years or so. Then, again, we get the Sabbath rest. So if you're a shepherd, you can't rest completely on the Sabbath day. You've got to get your animals cared for. If you're a farmer, then you can do nothing on the Sabbath day, but they're going to have to do something. But it's not going to be where they make everybody work as hard as they would the other days. And so they keep a jar of that manna for putting into the tabernacle. They complain about water, and then so Moses actually strikes a rock and water comes out of that. They're sure that God isn't going to take care of them. And no matter how many miracles you count up about what they did, the water getting pushed away so they can go through on dry ground, which is a form of the flood. Luther will talk about this as baptism, and that our sins get drowned like Pharaoh and his hosts in the flood. And then they get out into the wilderness a little bit, and the old Amalekites show up. Amalekites are going to be shown up all the way through the Bible, even in the book of Esther. The sense of the Amalekites are still going to be there. So when Moses is holding up his arms, they're winning. When Moses' arms get tired, then they lose. Dale, do you know what I'm going to talk about next?
Yes.
When I was in high school, we had, in phys ed class, there was the question about who could hold their arms out the longest. And Gary Leuthauser, whose parents later moved him to Colorado, he won. But Dale and I tried this at home to see who was going to be able to last the longest. Now, I think I did. Did I?
Yeah.
You agree with that? Sometimes I was going like this a little bit. I think I made it for 5-0 for 50 minutes. And I don't think I could sleep for 3 days after that. But so Moses' arms get heavy. So you shall be like faithful Aaron holding up the prophet's hands. They hold his arms up while Joshua's fighting the battle down below, and then they win. So God says, I can give you victory anytime you want the victory. So Aaron and Hur hold up the prophet's hands. Chapter 18 then, Moses reconnects with Jethro, his father-in-law, who rejoices with him but says, I'm going to stay here. And then he counsels reorganization. A lot of people will look to this text to find out how do you organize a church. Nobody should be deciding all the things. Pastor, the toilet is running in the bathroom. Now, Pastor, nobody shoveled the snow out in front of church. Now, that's not technically what you called me to do. There are people who do things and who can, and I can certainly paint a wall and I can shovel, but I used to say to people back in Michigan when I was talking with someone after a funeral and they're starting to pick up the chairs and put them away, I said, I can put the chairs away. Don't think I'm gabbing just so I don't have to do the work. I'm doing ministry right now. I'm talking to people and I'm talking about the burden that they have, that someone has died whom they love. And so recognize I'm doing what I got called to do here, and I can cut the lawn or do anything another time, but don't think I'm just trying to get out of work by what I'm doing. I know plenty about how to do good hard work like that. But Moses is sitting there from day to night trying to solve everybody's problems. He says, organize this in groups, hundreds and fifties and tens, and let the problem be solved at the lowest level of importance. If you don't need to solve it at a high level of importance, then don't go there. Okay, so we don't really have to say, Pastor, there's no coffee in the kitchen. Okay, somebody else who has that responsibility. So you break it down into a bunch of jobs. And when we left Michigan by then, I had gotten some insight from somebody. We had 31 different people elected to do stuff instead of the 12 that had been there before. And they all knew what they were to do each month for each committee. So you do something during this month, you report the end of that month. Some things like Vacation Bible School once a year, some things like ushering were every month in our case, or doing the nursery. Had enough, 26 ladies who were willing to work in the nursery. So twice a year, Jenny Smith would call them up. Prayer chains and things like that. Had the whole thing organized. One lady organized the whole thing, and you had somebody to pray for. Lucille had her whole list. She called everybody, and a whole bunch of people. 25, 30 people said they're willing to bring flowers for church. So you call them up before Easter. You say, what kind of flowers do you want? The year we did that, we had so many flowers we didn't know where to put them. The next year somebody puts a note in the bulletin, anyone wants to bring flowers, bring them. And we got 12 instead of 75. So you need a little bit of organization and make things work. Somebody says, well, we got all these extra light bulbs. What are we going to do with them? What do they do? People came and got some of them, didn't they?
Why? They had free recycle day.
And then you recycle the rest of them, right?
Yep.
But you don't need to ask me about that. Now, I'm a layperson here, so there can be things I can do here that I wouldn't do if I were a pastor. But Moses wore himself out. And his father-in-law says, that's not probably a good organizational chart. Make it work so that you divide up the jobs and everybody feels good about what they're doing. And so that's when I found out about time and talent sheets. And they work well and they don't work well, depending on the time, but you have to use them. You have to call people up and say, I see that you said you'd be willing to work on the furnace. We need some work on the furnace now. Sure, be right over. You know, they're checking something and they're saying, it's okay if you call me. And so here Moses is out in the wilderness and he's beginning to organize a structure for everybody. Jethro then returns home, and now we're in the travel on the way down to Mount Sinai or across to Mount Sinai. That's where we'll pick it up next week. That's all, folks. Da-da-da-da.